Marianne Holdzkom is a professor of history at Kennesaw State University who specializes in the American colonial and revolutionary eras with a focus on how these periods are remembered in popular culture. She is the author of Remembering John Adams, the Second President in History, Memory, and Popular Culture, which was named a Choice Review's Outstanding Academic Title. She's also currently researching a new book on major anniversary commemorations of the American Revolution. She is an Adams Memorial Foundation scholar and has contributed to efforts to build a John Adams Family Monument in Washington, D.C. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Marianne Holdzkom to the Georgia Archives.
Thank you, Robin, and thank all of you for being here this afternoon and joining me to talk a little bit about the Second Continental Congress. Now, some of you may recognize the title of my talk, Tittle, Twiddle, and Resolve. This is from the opening number in the musical 1776, which opened on Broadway in 1969. And I have a screenshot here of the film version with William Daniels of Boy Meets World fame, St. Elsewhere. You might know him from other things. He's playing John Adams, believe it or not. And in this first song in this musical, John Adams is lamenting to God about Congress. He is frustrated that Congress is dragging its feet on the issue of independence. And he says to God, I won't sing it, I could, but I won't. You see, we piddle, twiddle, and resolve. Nothing's ever solved in foul, fetid, fuming, foggy, filthy Philadelphia. So that frustration is just coming out in droves here. And the questions that I want to address today is, how do we get to this point? We are in the 250th anniversary of the Second Continental Congress. At this point, you know, we do have a 250th anniversary of the Declaration coming up, right? All of a sudden, Rob and I were just talking about this. People are waking up going, oh, yeah, it's this year. So these commemorations have been going on for a long time. But one of the things that I wanted to share with you today was what was the role of the Continental Congress? What authority did it have? And who were some of the personalities that attended the Congress to make it what it was? And then finally, the fun part for me, how was the Second Continental Congress depicted in popular culture so far? And I want to say, just starting out here, that part of what I want to do here is talk about the Congress, lift them up a little bit. I'm a big fan of Ken Burns, and I enjoyed his American Revolution series, but I felt like the Continental Congress was kind of missing from that. I understand why, I understand the intent, but I think it's really important to commemorate what this body did, because they were actually the leadership during the Revolutionary War, and we tend to forget that. Now, let me start with some context for you. Having a Second Continental Congress indicates that there was a first. And the First Continental Congress met in September and October of 1774 in Philadelphia, in this building. It's called Carpenter's Hall. And the reason that this Continental Congress happened was because Parliament had recently passed a series of laws aimed at Massachusetts called the Coercive Acts. The colonies called them the Intolerable Acts. And this was in response to the Boston Tea Party in 1773. So things have been kind of spiraling out of control. And it was decided that it would be a good idea for certain delegates from the colonies to get together, meet face to face for the first time, and talk about these issues. Now, this wasn't unprecedented. There had been a continental-wide Congress in 1765 in response to the Stamp Act, but only 9 colonies sent delegates to that particular Congress. This will be a little bit different. Now, there will be 12 of the 13 colonies attending the First Continental Congress in 1774. And one of those delegates is John Adams. As Robin mentioned to you, I researched John Adams. He is kind of my guy. And so his views are going to be pretty upfront here. He is going to write in June of 1774, "There is a new and grand scene open before me, a Congress. This will be an assembly of the wisest men upon the continent, who are American in principle, i.e., against the taxation of Americans by authority of Parliament." Now, Adams feels unequal to this task, and he says so in his diary. And he also writes letters to everyone he can think of. "Give me advice. What do I need to know? What do you want us to do?" I mean, you can just feel the anxiety in these letters. But he also says, "I will keep an exact diary of my journey, as well as a journal of the proceedings of the Congress." And he did. Thank God he did, because we have a lot of the record of what happened at the Congress, but we also get these delightful character sketches from John Adams of just about everybody he met. Excuse me, I have sinus issues. So John Adams is going to write in his diary about these people and say amazing things about them. And you have to say, okay, well, this is from John Adams' point of view, so we have to be careful with that a little bit. Now, let's talk a minute about Georgia. Georgia was the 13th colony, and Georgia did not send delegates to the First Continental Congress. And the question is, why? And there are several answers to this question. One is that Georgia tended to lean really loyalist during this period. The royal governor of Georgia, James Wright, was a loyalist and basically said, "Don't you even think about this. It's not going to happen." Georgia depended a good deal on the British military for protection as well. And recently, Georgia had experienced an uprising on the part of the Creeks. So they were not particularly interested in provoking the English in any way, shape, or form. There are a group of men in that area that is today Savannah who were members of the Sons of Liberty and who were interested in these proceedings, and they basically sent letters to people who were going and said, "Sorry, we can't make it, but please keep us informed about what's happening." Okay, so there is a faction in Georgia who is interested in the First Continental Congress. Now, our neighbor to the north, South Carolina, does send delegates to the Congress. They will send 5 in all, and I have pictured 2 here because they represent different constituencies in South Carolina. Christopher Gadsden here was from Charleston and tended to represent the day laborers, the mechanics, what we would call in the 18th century, the lower sorts. So he was a bit of a radical for his time. And then there's Edward Rutledge. And I picked Edward Rutledge for a couple of reasons. Number one, he was an extraordinarily young man in 1774. 24 years old, I think. Remember yourself at 24 and ask yourself if you would be willing to have done what he's doing here. He is also one of the delegates from the South who appears prominently in the popular culture. So I'll get to that in a few minutes. But Edward Rutledge is representing the planter class in South Carolina. Now, the instructions that these delegates receive in South Carolina is really interesting. The General Committee in South Carolina says that they want union with the inhabitants of all our sister colonies, and they instruct their delegates to cooperate with the other delegates in developing legal measures that would lead to the repeal of the hated intolerable acts. South Carolina's General Committee also agreed that South Carolina would not be bound by any actions that a majority of the delegates oppose. So in other words, South Carolina says, we don't want to be out front, but we don't want to be left behind. We want to be right smack dab in the middle with the majority. So pay attention to what the majority will be doing at this Congress. Now, the First Continental Congress delegates make it very clear that they are not interested in independence. This is something I have to emphasize to my students all the time, who seem to have this idea that when the first settlers landed in Jamestown, they were thinking about, oh, let's build the United States. It simply is not true. And the vast majority of the delegates that come to the First Continental Congress are wanting to assert their rights as Englishmen. They believe England is the greatest nation on earth. Does that sound familiar? And they don't want to be separated from it. But they also feel that England is violating her own constitution by not granting them a say in taxation. So they want to assert their rights as first-class citizens in this empire. And one of the big debates that comes up in this First Continental Congress is, how do we do that? And what authority does England actually have over us? And there's much disagreement about this. Some of the delegates say, well, we answer to the king only. Others say, no, Parliament has full authority over us, so we should listen to them and work with them. So there's a lot of give and take, back and forth, a lot of fights over these issues, no agreement whatsoever. And this gets to John Adams after a while as well. You remember how excited he was about this Congress? Let me read to you a portion of a letter that he wrote to his remarkable wife, Abigail. This is on October 9th. The Congress has been in session a little over a month now. He says, "My dear, I am wearied to death with the life I lead. The business of the Congress is tedious beyond expression. This assembly is like no other that ever existed. Every man in it is a great man, an orator, a critic, a statesman, and therefore every man upon every question must show his oratory, his criticism, and his political abilities. The consequence of this is that business is drawn and spun out to an immeasurable length. I believe if it was moved and seconded that we should come to a resolution that 3 and 2 make 5, we should be entertained with logic and rhetoric, law, history, politics, and mathematics concerning the subject for 2 whole days, and then we should pass the resolution unanimously in the affirmative." I've been to some meetings where I feel like that. I don't know about you, but believe me, this quote comes to mind quite often. So it's clear that John Adams is no longer particularly excited with what's happening at the Congress. So what did they accomplish in the end? Well, they will write a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. This was a very popular thing to do in the period. This is what we're mad about. This is why. And this is why you should fix it. They will send petitions to the King, to the House of Lords, and to the House of Commons, making sure they're covering all their bases. And those petitions are interesting. The ones to the king are very, oh, we love you, your majesty. They're very submissive, very what I would call passive puppy. The ones to the House of Lords, a little less so. The ones to the House of Commons are like, look, Sparky, you need to stop taxing us without our consent. All right, so, and you need to lift the Intolerable Act. So it depends on the body in terms of how these petitions are read. And then they will pass something called the Continental Association. And this is a continental-wide boycott. This is the kind of thing that has worked for them in the past. And the Continental Association was going to have 2 phases. One was that they would stop all imports of English goods. But the second phase was new and different. They wanted to stop exports to England. And at this point, 4 of the 5 delegates from South Carolina walk out of the Congress because they feel that banning exports of rice and indigo would hurt South Carolina more than the other colonies. Christopher Gadsden, by the way, is the only one of the delegates who remains behind. And a compromise will be reached. Finally, Congress says, okay, we will have a ban on exports with the exception of rice and indigo. And so the South Carolina delegates can go home having saved face. I mention that because if you're familiar with the musical 1776, there is a famous walkout of the South, which did not happen. But it's interesting that it did happen in the First Continental Congress, at least with South Carolina. They will adjourn on October 26th, 1774, with the agreement that if the situation with England has not improved, they will reconvene on May 10th, 1775, once again in Philadelphia. And as you all know, the situation had not improved. In fact, it had deteriorated. By May 10th, 1775, New England essentially is at war with England after the battles of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. So delegates, once again, will meet in Philadelphia, this time in this building, the Pennsylvania State House, the building we now call Independence Hall. We have some returning delegates from the First Continental Congress. John and Samuel Adams are back. John Dickinson, who was at the First Continental Congress, will also be at the second. I'm not going to say that his views have changed very much. John Dickinson was kind of a rock star in terms of English, in terms of colonial resistance to the English. But he's come to the conclusion that he's really afraid that people are going to start using the I word, independence. And so he really wants to come to the Congress to fight for reconciliation. And this gentleman here, George Washington. George Washington was a delegate to both of these Congresses. He shows up to the Second Continental Congress saying, oh, well, you know, I fought with the English during the French and Indian War. I know how they work. But I don't want any special treatment here. Don't think that I do. And yet he arrives to the meetings every day in his dress blue uniform, looking very much like an Army commander. All right, so you have to wonder what was going on there. I think there was a little bit of an agenda on the part of George Washington. There's some new faces here, a couple of names you may be familiar with. Thomas Jefferson, all of 32 years old in 1775. Is now a delegate from Virginia. And on the other end of the spectrum here, we have Benjamin Franklin, who has been serving as a diplomat in England for several years now. He has most recently been humiliated by Parliament and by the Privy Council over some letters that he sent to Samuel Adams saying, please, these are for your eyes only. Don't publish them in the newspaper. Samuel Adams published them in the newspaper, because that's what Samuel Adams does. And so he gets himself into some trouble. So he has sailed home, and he too will be representing Pennsylvania on the side of, let's talk about independence. So Pennsylvania has a divided delegation here. And, drum roll please, we have a delegate from Georgia, Dr. Lyman Hall. Now, Lyman Hall joins the Congress in 1775, not representing Georgia, but representing St. John's Parish in Georgia, which anyone out there can correct me. That's the area around Savannah. Am I right? Thank you. Okay. He comes to Congress, he engages in the debates, but he does not vote. And the reason he doesn't vote is because he is not representing yet the colony of Georgia. But he's the lone face from Georgia. Now, what has happened since the First Continental Congress adjourned? As I mentioned, New England is at war with the English. And the other colonies from New England south are wondering what this is going to mean for them. They make it pretty clear when they first arrive at the Second Continental Congress that they're not interested in war and that this is not their fight. And so the Massachusetts delegates have an agenda. They come to the Congress trying to convince their sister colonies that this is a continental-wide fight and that all of the colonies need to be involved because there is no way Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island can fight the most powerful army and navy in the world by themselves. Simply not going to work. This is a hard sell, and yet they do make some achievements along the line. Congress will finally adopt the group of militiamen that are surrounding Boston in the summer of 1775 as the Continental Army. And then they will choose George Washington to lead it. George Washington stands up and he says to the Congress a little bit more eloquently than this, but I'm paraphrasing, "I'll do the best I can, God help me." Because he knows what he's up against better than anyone in the room. And then he leaves in June of 1775 to go and meet his new army. All of this is within the context that there are still voices for reconciliation in Congress. So some of the accomplishments in 1775 are basically military in scope. Any Marine out there will tell you that the Marine Corps was born in November 1775 in a tavern.
Hoorah.
Thank you. And this is quite an accomplishment because not only have we adopted the Continental Army, the Congress has done this, but we also now have a Marine Corps. And they're making baby step progress toward a Navy. Basically asking merchants to put guns on their ships was our Navy to begin with. So those things are happening. These are accomplishments, and it's pretty amazing because at this point, I should mention authority here. The Second Continental Congress was an extra-legal organization. It depends on the various colonies to instruct it. So it can't move on an issue, it can't debate an issue unless it has clear instructions from the 13 colonies. And this is going to be one of the reasons why there is so little progress toward independence. Because most of the delegates who are at the Congress do not have instructions to vote for an independency from England. And we see some of the divisions in Congress through two petitions that Congress wrote and signed in 1775. The first is the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson basically says, look, we don't want this fight, but we're not going to roll over and allow you to stomp on our rights. We are going to stand up and we're going to fight like men, and that's why we have taken up arms. So it's pretty aggressive in nature. But then there's another petition signed a few days later called the Olive Branch Petition. And by the name, you might be able to figure out what this means. This petition is drafted primarily by John Dickinson. And it says, please, we can work it out. Please. We want reconciliation. We love being English. We don't want to be American. Please. Essentially. And some of the more radical delegates are like, are we really going to do this again? But they sign it. They send it off to the king, King George III. He reads this one. He rejects this one. And in response to this one, he declares the colonies an open rebellion, which means he says, you are outside of my protection. My army and navy can do whatever they want to you. And this is a blow to the people who want reconciliation in Congress. Another development in 1775, ta-da, Georgia sends official delegates to the Congress. There will be 5 in all initially. John Houston, Archibald Bullock, pictured here. The Reverend Dr. 𝘙𝘠𝘠𝘮𝘰, pictured here. Lyman Hall, I have him in bold because he's been here already. And Wimberly Jones. That's a great name. Wimberly Jones. Now, some of you who signed the Declaration of Independence might notice that there's only one name here that appears on that actual document, and that's Lyman Hall. Some of these delegates are in favor of independence, some of them are not. Dr. 𝘙𝘠𝘠𝘮 is one. He leaves Congress when he sees which direction it's headed. And these delegates will also be replaced over time by delegates who are instructed to vote in favor of independence. So how do we get to independence? We're going to be creeping there. And we start with a little document that we will be celebrating, I think it's tomorrow, the 250th anniversary of the publication of a little pamphlet called Common Sense that was written by a migrant from England named Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, like Samuel Adams, actually failed at everything he did except politics and writing. Thomas Paine was a brilliant writer. And he writes Common Sense shortly after he arrives in the colonies. He looks around and he says, I don't know what you people are hesitating about. And in Common Sense, he basically says to the American people, you don't need a king. Declare your independence, set up a republic, and get on with it. And what Paine was really brilliant at is knowing his audience. He uses a lot of religious analogies. He himself was an agnostic, but he knows the people he's writing for are mostly Protestant Christians. And so he uses a lot of language like that. And he also uses a lot of interesting examples. Like he says, England's way over there and you're here. Why would God do that if he wanted England to be ruling over you? That makes no sense. And he also says, England is this big and you're this big. So these are the kinds of things that the common people who weren't lawyers, could understand. And Common Sense flies off the shelves of bookstores in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. Everywhere it's published becomes a bestseller. And the people read it and they go to their colonial assemblies and they say, is this what you've all been talking about all along? If it is, get on with it. We need to declare independence. So his influence is huge here. And so we begin to see the tide turning. Now, another date that may not be familiar to you is May 15th, 1776. And on this day, John Adams writes to his friend James Warren. And he says, this day, the Congress has passed the most important resolution that ever was taken in America. It's not what you think. This resolution from Congress instructed all of the colonies to, quote, institute such forms of government as to them shall appear necessary to promote the happiness of the people. Now let that sink in for a moment. What Congress is doing here is telling the various colonies, set up your own governments because the British are on their way out. And we don't want anarchy, so we have to have governments in place. And for John Adams and other delegates in favor of independence, this is independence de facto. They're there. It's just a matter of declaring it now and making it official. 5 days later, John Adams writes again to his friend Warren, every post and every day rolls in upon us independence like a torrent. And here's the part you're going to like. The delegates from Georgia made their appearance this day in Congress with unlimited powers, and these gentlemen themselves are very firm for independence. South Carolina has erected her government and given her delegates ample powers, and they are firm enough. North Carolina has given their full powers after repealing an instruction given last August against Confederation and independence. So John Adams is getting so excited he can hardly stand himself. He's like, it's happening. It's happening, and we just have to wait for a resolution to be on the floor so that we can vote on independence. And that resolution comes in on June 7th, 1776 from the colony of Virginia, presented by Richard Henry Lee, which is why we call it the Lee Resolution. And that resolution says, you can kind of read it here, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that any connection between them and England is and ought to be totally dissolved. So now we have the resolution on the floor. It can be debated. And also, it is decided that a committee needs to be formed to write a formal declaration. A declaration stating why they're doing what they're doing and justifying it. On July 2nd, 1776, the vote on independence is taken. And this is remarkable. It was decided that the vote on independence needed to be unanimous so that no colony would be fighting another colony on this issue. And after weeks of political maneuvering and quartering people in taverns, those advocates for independence have managed a 12-0 vote on independence with one abstention. And the abstention is not Georgia, it's New York. Mainly because the delegates from New York have received no instructions whatsoever. So they can't do anything. This is remarkable. And John Adams' response is quite famous. You read it every 4th of July or so. He writes to his remarkable wife, Abigail, once again, and he says, the day is past. July 2nd, 1776 will be remembered as the greatest epoch in America. And he talks about how we should celebrate the day. And he says, you might think that I'm transported with enthusiasm, but I am not. I understand, I'm paraphrasing, what this is going to take. But then he says, and this is something that always gets to me and I always remember it, even in the darkest times. John Adams says, through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. And so for John Adams, July 2nd was our birthday. 2 days later, on July 4th, the Declaration of Independence is adopted. And this is the formal statement of what they did 2 days before and why. The Declaration, as you all know, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, with some pretty stirring words that we still hold dear today. And then the document will be formally signed on August 2nd. And as I have to remind my students, that's not the end of the Second Continental Congress. Their work is not done, not by a long shot. They have to run the war. They have to send diplomats to places like France and Spain because they know they can't win this on their own. They have to set up a confederation of some sort. State governments are great, but there are certain things a national government has to do. So the work of the Congress continues after this point, and we tend to forget that. Okay, now for the fun part. As I said, Ken Burns kind of flew over the Continental Congresses. And I was surprised, we sort of went from common sense to the Declaration of Independence, and there was no sense of how we actually got there. But the Continental Congress itself does appear from time to time in popular culture. And I just wanted to give you a sense of what some of these depictions look like. And I wanted to start with some of the paintings. There are 2 paintings basically centered on the Declaration of Independence. This one is by Robert Edge Pine. And there's a very famous engraving of this by Edward Savage. And this is basically Congress voting on independence. And they all look kind of stagnant in this moment. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when this vote was taken, just to see how people were reacting. But the more famous painting tied to the Declaration is this one that I'm sure you've all seen. Maybe some of you have actually seen it in person in our US Capitol building. This is John Trumbull's The Declaration of Independence. And it is sometimes mistitled The Signing of the Declaration of Independence. That's not what Trumbull is depicting here. He is focusing in on June 28th, 1776, which was the day that the Declaration Committee, standing here, present the Declaration to John Hancock and to the Congress for them to vote. Now, I found this online. I thought this was a pretty handy dandy diagram of who's in this painting. One of the things that people will always point out about this painting is that John Trumbull doesn't have everybody in the room who was in the room, and some people who weren't in the room appear in the painting. Later in life, he is going to paint these signers of the Declaration of Independence from life. And he will also put some people in here who didn't sign the Declaration of Independence. This diagram has stars by those people. And John Dickinson is in this painting. But John Dickinson, interestingly enough, refuses to sign the Declaration. He joins the Army, and he will later serve in the Constitutional Convention. But he just couldn't bring himself to do this. Now, the other thing down here, I think this is very, very useful. He talks about some of the people who aren't in the painting who signed the Declaration. And I don't know if you can read this or not, but 𝘔𝘠𝘮𝘮𝘮 of Georgia and Lyman Hall of Georgia are not in this painting. The one Georgia delegate, right there, sitting by the guy in the hat. And the only reason I know that is because the diagram tells me. This is George Walton. Okay, so he gets to be in the painting. Lyman Hall and 𝘔𝘠𝘮𝑮 do not. Don't ask me why. There may be some research here that I need to do into this to try to figure out what was going on here. Maybe it is that these gentlemen had no paintings that Trumbull could work from, because he did that a lot to try to get their facial features correct. I just don't know. But George Walton is there, barely, in the painting. Now, as far as film and television is concerned, there are a lot of different depictions of the Continental Congress. The most famous is probably the musical 1776, because it takes place in the Congress. There's really little else that goes on anywhere else in that musical. And if you haven't seen the film, I do recommend it. TCM shows it every 4th of July. You can get it on Amazon. And you can get the full director's cut, because there was a song that was taken out of the film before it came out in 1972 because Richard Nixon didn't like it. Okay, so it was highly politicized. It was called Cool Conservative Men. And Nixon did not like that song. So, but now you can see it. You can see the film in full. The Adams Chronicles, which was a PBS series based upon the Adams family. You can see the Continental Congress there. John Jakes wrote a series of books, later made into the miniseries. The Rebels was 1979, I believe, and they also depict the Continental Congress. There's a fictional character that is a delegate from Virginia who serves on the Declaration Committee as well. Justin Fletcher is just like everywhere, but he was a fully fictional character. Liberty's Kids. Maybe some of you remember Liberty's Kids, maybe your kids remember Liberty's Kids, but the Continental Congress plays a prominent role in that animated show. Who knew? The John Adams miniseries, of course, John Adams here, played by Paul Giamatti, one of the few actors who's played John Adams who actually looks like him, I think. And so those are just a few that I am aware of in film and television. And I want to just finish out here by talking about a couple of views of some of the Southern delegates that we see in these popular culture offerings. Edward Rutledge plays a very important role in 1776 in particular. He is played by an actor named John Cullum. You see him here. And John Cullum is essentially, or Edward Rutledge is essentially portrayed as someone who's leading all of the South. North Carolina defers to South Carolina, and the leader of South Carolina is Edward Rutledge, at this point about 26 years old. And in the show and in the movie, Edward Rutledge is going to call Jefferson and John Adams to task over the slave trade clause that Jefferson included in the Declaration of Independence. And Rutledge is going to say, our slaves are not Americans, they're property. And Jefferson says, no, they are people who are being treated as property. And there's a huge debate, ending with a really, really incredibly moving song called Molasses to Rum to Slaves, in which Edward Rutledge points out that Northerners and Southerners were guilty in the slave trade. And then the Southern delegation walks out. So Edward Rutledge is one of the stars of this show, no question. He also appears in the John Adams miniseries, and I wanted these two screenshots just to show you how different Edward Rutledge looks to film writers. This time he's played by an actor named Clancy O'Connor, and his most important scene is when he's sitting on a bench with John Adams, and he says, "Look, Mr. Adams, South Carolina doesn't really want to stand in the way of independence. But if you cannot guarantee us that independence will be unanimous, we don't want to have anything to do with it." So once again, we get this sense that South Carolina doesn't want to be left behind, but they're not going to be out in the lead either. And so he eventually assures John Adams, we'll be on board if you can guarantee a unanimous vote. And then you may have been wondering about Georgia. Once again, the only Georgia delegate I have ever found in popular culture is Dr. Lyman Hall, depicted in 1776. And we see Lyman Hall arrive at the Continental Congress, and the other Southern delegates trying to figure out what's in his head, what is he thinking? And he says, well, my convictions are personal. And Edward Rutledge pushes him on this, and he says, what are your convictions? And he said, well, as I said, they're personal. I'm not going to tell you. But Rutledge says, the South speaks as one voice. Okay, so he's making it clear to Lyman Hall, watch your step here. And then at the end of the musical, Lyman Hall plays a pivotal role. After the South has walked out, John Adams is in the dumps. He gets a pep talk from his wife, Abigail. Don't ask me how she's there. It's movie magic. And he comes back downstairs and he sings what we call in the musical theater the 11 o'clock song. It's called Is Anybody There? And it's an adaptation of his letter to Abigail on July 3rd. It's an incredible piece of music. And when he's finished singing, Lyman Hall walks into the congressional chamber and he says to John Adams, you know, I've been thinking about my own personal convictions. I'm in favor of independence. The people aren't. What do I do about this? And he assures John Adams, when the vote happens on independence, Georgia will vote yay. So he plays that role. And I've been trying to figure out from the playwright, from the historical note, why he chose Lyman Hall for this moment. I don't know. None of the other Georgia delegates appear in this musical, just Lyman Hall. But there it is. Georgia is represented in this popular culture. So finally, I want to emphasize the importance of the Second Continental Congress. One of the things that we can say here is that, you know, this is a bunch of white guys in white stockings and white wigs. But they were doing things. They were working hard. And I can safely say none of this would have happened without their leadership. Their role evolves over time. They keep an army in the field. They're not very good at it sometimes, but they do it. They send diplomats to France and Spain. They send them instructions. They put together the Articles of Confederation, which was our first US Constitution. They should not be lifted up as a model of perfect governing, because they were not that, not by a long shot. But their leadership role was vital. And as we approach the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, I hope you can give a thought or two each day to what the Second Continental Congress was doing, the kinds of struggles they were up against, and the kinds of accomplishments that they were able to pull off in this very, very tense time. So thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it very much. And also, if you're interested in my book, this is the shameless plug. I have flyers up here. I also have some bookmarks with the publisher's information on it. And I would be happy now to take your questions. Thank you. Yes.
Question about sort of your concluding thing that Lyman Hall was the only Georgian who shows up. Were there any other states that only had one delegate represented in the musical, and the author was just like, let's see, I've got New Hampshire, he's included, was it something like that? They just spun the wheel and landed on Hall, maybe, or?
That very well could be. It's important to note, and that's a great question, was Georgia the only one with just one delegate represented in 1776? The author of the show, there's a wonderful historical note at the end of the script. And he says, we just couldn't fill the stage with 55 men. So we consolidated the delegates. So the John Adams character is kind of a conglomeration of John and Samuel, for example, and he's the only delegate from Massachusetts, when in fact there were 5. The same is true of South Carolina and a couple of the other colonies, including Georgia. So I think that's the reason, but I honestly don't know why out of the 3 signers of the Declaration, he chose Lyman Hall. Except that Lyman Hall had been there the longest. That's the only thing I can think of. And I was mentioning to Robin earlier, I would really be interested in learning more about Lyman Hall to see if I could come up with an answer to this question. Thank you. There was another. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm curious about the portrayal of the Southern Bloc. So did they really see themselves as a bloc at that time, or is that just in the movie?
Very good question. The question was this idea of a Southern Bloc. Did they see themselves this way? Not necessarily, no. I think that was kind of a throwback to what was seen earlier, maybe even a throwback to the idea of the Civil War. I have no idea. But it's very clear if you look at the South throughout even the early national period, South Carolina is kind of out there in terms of states' rights more than Virginia or North Carolina is. So I don't think we can say they were necessarily a bloc here. Good question. Yes,
I have a question about the First Continental Congress. How did that get started? Was there one of the colonies that kind of took the lead because there was no central authority? And all of a sudden, 13 colonies get a call from someone to gather. How did that all get started?
and that's a very good question about the First Continental Congress and how that got started. The Sons of Liberty had chapters in all 13 colonies. And as recently as 1772, they had formed something called the Committee of Correspondence, in which they were writing letters to each other to keep each other informed. And it was really around this structure of the Committee of Correspondence that this meeting came into being. And Mary Beth Norton talks about this, and she said the meeting was actually called as sort of a middle ground solution. Some of the people in other colonies, the middle colonies in particular, New York, Pennsylvania, were worried that Massachusetts, because they were so under the gun, were going to go out there and start raising an army and doing something crazy. And so they said, no, wait a minute, let's have a meeting. Let's meet and talk about this. And I believe the actual meeting call came from Pennsylvania or New York. I would have to double check that. But interestingly, it's not coming from Massachusetts.
But there was kind of a consensus through the Sons of Liberty, perhaps, that different colonies started kind of talking, and then other ones started to talk about a Congress.
Yes, exactly. And I also emphasize to my students how serious the situation is in 1774, because a group of colonies who never really wanted to cooperate in any way, shape, or form are willing to get together in a meeting. They are saying we can't be relying on letters and newspapers and pamphlets anymore. We've got to get together and talk. Yes.
You mentioned about the slavery issue. Could you go into a little bit more detail on that? And then I have another question.
Okay, yes. The slavery issue in the Second Continental Congress is not what it appears in the popular culture. I hate to say that. Jefferson wrote a clause that he wanted included in the Declaration of Independence, blaming George III for the slave trade. And what he was doing in that particular portion of the Declaration is finding all kinds of things to lay at George III's feet. And that was the portion of the Declaration that was the most important to people at the time. They wanted to know what the grievances were. And so the Declaration Committee is brainstorming and saying, oh, well, remember when he did this? Remember he suspended trial by jury, all of these things. So Jefferson just throws in the slave trade and puts it at the feet of George III. And the rest of Congress says, I'm not sure it's fair to do that. That we can't really blame George III for the slave trade. And so it will be Congress's decision, a majority decision, to take out that clause. And so slavery itself is not something that's ever discussed here, but it was the slave trade that Jefferson was attacking.
I guess my question would be about the 3/5
Mhm.
the Constitution, really.
Yes, yeah.
And that is that many people have the idea that the North free people and in the South were the slaves.
Right.
And at that time, wasn't it true that every state was a slave-owning state?
Yes, slavery was legal in all of the colonies. After the Revolution, after about 1783, some of the states, I think Massachusetts may have been the first, will begin efforts to outlaw slavery. But slavery was legal in the North and the South. And I do emphasize that to my students because there is this misconception that there were no slaves in the North, and that's simply not true. Yes. Anyone? Yes.
What was the nature of their anticipation of the war? Was there much talk about what they were going to get into? Did they think it was going to be just a few weeks, or did they anticipate several years? And did George Washington ever have any misgivings?
Every day. Yes. One of the questions was, did George Washington have any misgivings? Yes, every day. I don't think they could really anticipate how long the war was going to be. As you might know, when it comes to war, leadership always tells you, oh, it's going to be short war. The boys will be home by Christmas is always the famous saying. And so Congress really has no clue how long this is going to go on. And in the midst of this, Congress will send a committee, including John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, to meet with the commander of the British Army and the admiral of the British Navy to talk about reconciliation. And John Adams and Benjamin Franklin really have no interest in this, but they say, yeah, we'll go and we'll talk and see what they want. But it becomes very clear after, I'd say, 1776 into 1777, that the war was going to drag on. And part of the reason for that is that all George Washington really had to do is hang on. It's the British who are kind of in a bad position here. Supply lines. Once the French enter the war in 1778, they've got a two-front war. It becomes a world war, actually, which is their worst nightmare. So in terms of what Congress is anticipating, it's a day-by-day thing, and we're making it up as they go along. And they are also very dependent on the colonies themselves for recruitment of arms, for raising supplies, raising money. And that doesn't go very well either. The army is in poor shape for most of the war because they just can't get the colonies to provide them with what they need. It's amazing that the colonies actually won this war. Yes, sir.
I always wondered if there was a third Continental Congress because, you know, I think a lot of people think the first, the second, but Congress really stayed in session.
Yes.
They may have taken a break for a while. They came back later, but there was never a closing down of the Congress. They just stayed in session then, and they became the U.S. Congress, I guess, you know.
Yeah, eventually what's going to happen here is the Second Continental Congress is the leadership. They will write the Articles of Confederation, which has to be ratified by the states. That will happen in 1781. And when that happens, then you have some of the delegates from the Second Continental Congress becoming delegates to the Confederation Congress, which is the only government on a national scale. There's no president, there's no judiciary, nothing. It's Congress. So it kind of morphs into the Confederation Congress. Anything else? This is great. I could do this all day. I know you don't want me to, though. Well, thank you so much.